Welcome to the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act virtual pilgrimage. My name is the Reverend John Borthwick, and the community I serve here at St. Andrews in Guelph has been journeying with me all the way back into the fall through this book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. We are on Thing 20. We're almost done. Just a few more episodes to go. We will be finished and wrapping up just around Easter and Holy Week. And so, let's do 20. Number 20. Denied Indians the right to vote. Denied Indians the right to vote. The Indian Act denied them the right to vote all the way until 1960. Yeah. So, in a democracy like Canada, that Canada has been founded on, the idea of people having the right to vote would seem to be entrenched in a vibrant and fully engaged democracy. We know that there have been peoples throughout the history of our democracy who've been excluded from the right to vote. We know that within the civil rights movement, and we know that within the women's rights movement of getting the vote only after the Second World War. The First World War, I apologize. So it's not surprising that the fact that this ability to participate in our democracy as a country, as a nation, has been excluded to Indigenous persons. Now, what's interesting is Bob does note that in most parts of Canada, Indians were offered the right to vote at the time of Confederation, but only if they gave up their treaty rights and their Indian status. So, here we go. Once again, the Indigenous Act, the Indian Act, has certainly impacted the ability of Indigenous peoples to fully participate in this thing called Canada and in our democracy. So often, when the proposal to allow Indigenous people to vote came up, and it did come up as a part of this process, it seemed that what you needed to do was give up your status, give up who you are, your identity. But it also meant that you had to participate in a system that wasn't a system that you were raised with, a system that you understood, a system that you would even fully grasp. And that's no disrespect to Indigenous peoples. It's they had a different form of governance before contact, a different form of how they even do their tribal, their Indigenous community kind of voting and participation and leadership. All those kinds of things were different. But in a typical white supremacist, culturally supremacist kind of vision of how things work, this is how we do things, and this is what you must do in order to participate. And one of those things that you must do is give up who you are, your identity again, this whole Indian status thing. Interesting that other people aren't told that they have to give up that in order to participate. You don't have to be, give up your Scottish heritage or your traditions or practice your beliefs if you're, participating in some way. For some reason, that's just not on the table. And so raising this up for us as a part of the Indian Act demonstrates again how, as Indigenous people fought in our wars, the World War I, World War II, all the land stuff, all the schooling stuff, all the decisions that are made by our country are formed in a way by this democratic process. And if you exclude individuals, groups of people from that process, from voting, then who are you voting in? And we're seeing this even today in our political systems. If you, certainly from our neighbors in the South, but it happens here too. If we're intentionally excluding or maybe not disenfranchising, because in many cases people have the vote, but how one participates in voting, how one gets registered, how one gets informed, how one navigates a system? Is it accessible? Is it fully engaged? It's always tragic to see the voter turnout, even in this free country called Canada, when so many people have the right to vote here, and yet so many people do not exercise it. So, all these are questions around voting and everything else, but the fact that Indigenous people weren't allowed to participate for quite some time. Now, because Indigenous people did and were willing to serve Canada in the wars that occurred, it seems that Bob is suggesting that after the Second World War, the federal government began to say it was time for that to happen, that Indigenous peoples should have full rights of citizenship after the war ended. Again, I'm fascinated by the lines that Bob has used. He's used it before, but this idea, here's a line. The horrors of World War II made Canadians aware of human rights and that there were people on their own soil, the very people who had contributed so much to the Allied victory, who were living in appalling conditions. Right. I believe the UN at one point, and in our very recent history, suggested that what was happening within Canada with our Indigenous peoples was a human rights violation, was against essentially our charter. That continues today. Boil water advisories, inadequate living conditions, the tragedies of being disrupted by different kinds of things, forest fires, flooding. These things are going on in our own country. I guess after the Second World War, people discovered that human rights were actually a thing. I don't quite get that, but okay. But again, if you've had a very tunneled vision kind of way of seeing the world for quite some time, reinforced by your government, your church, your community, and your workplace, and your family system, okay, I guess there's no way of seeing anything beyond. And so I should backpedal a bit and just say, look, I've been raised in a certain culture, a certain worldview, and it's easy to look back and, with judgment on those people. It just is fascinating to me that this is something that they discovered after World War II, that there are such a thing called human rights. Okay. Well, thank goodness they did, because that it only took them, a decade or more to finally get Indigenous people enfranchised, to be able to have it. But so they made the recommendation in 1948. Then they extended it to the Inuit people. There was some pushback on that. But it still also imposed some of its own ways. Says he's also suggesting that there's some apathy along the way as well. But it was really not until 1960, under the leadership of Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, that the right to vote was extended unconditionally to all Indigenous peoples. Unconditionally is the key word there. Because even as they started putting forth ideas or how will this happen, so again, after the war, 15 years later it takes for the right to vote being extended unconditionally. You didn't have to give up treaty rights. You didn't have to take on something within your own system. You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to do that. You could just be allowed to vote because you are a citizen of Canada. 15 years it took after people discovered that there was something called human rights. Yeah. This Indian Act, it's something. We've got one more thing to go. That's coming up next week. And then we've got a good percentage of the book is devoted to some terms and references, but also a little bit of a conversation of, which is a typical thing to raise up and an important thing to raise up. So if not the Indian Act, then what? And Bob's going to answer that question in about 2 weeks' time. Look forward to continuing this journey, this virtual pilgrimage with you. Thank you for joining me.